We're now live on YouTube with the June 19th meeting of the Node.js modules team. We have 7 of us on the call today. We don't have a super packed agenda, but there are some things on there. Is anyone from the team able to help with notes today? Please don't all volunteer at once. Drop the notes link into the chat, as well as the issue. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. Please, someone help with notes. The first issue to discuss today is number 341, which is package exports.
I think Jan was going to be able to join after 30 minutes, so he was asking if we can maybe do that one later.
Okay, so let's punt that one for right now. I guess we can maybe start with proposal default type. I believe that's yours, Jeff.
Sure. So yeah, I guess I can share it. So it was pretty much what you see here. We had another flag default type that would be appropriate to use in node options. The initial suggestion was default type module or common.js, similar to input type, and it would affect input type so that, like, currently if you leave out input type, it defaults to common.js. This would do the reverse, where it defaults to module, and you have to explicitly say input type equals common.js if you want that. Likewise, it would affect the package adjacent type field, where if the field's missing, it's assumed to be common.js. This would flip it around so that missing means module, and you have to have explicitly type common.js. So it's, if that's all we do, it's of limited utility. Like, it would help people who, use Node for shell scripting and they want to use like ESM shell scripts all over the place or something like that. Basically, any project that has common.js dependencies, those common.js dependencies would break because they wouldn't have type common.js in their package adjacents unless you just go ahead and add them yourself, add that to the package adjacent yourself. Or what we're assuming or thinking is that this might be something that package managers like NPM and Yarn and so on might start doing. Or we could just add a third option for that, like default type equals module except dependencies or something like that, to scope this to not include these common.js dependencies. Those are all options. Like, what we were kind of thinking was put this out there with the most minimal version, module and common.js, and kind of start from there and see what the reaction is. And then if we want to, broaden its applicability, that could, come in like later phases, I think the thinking, especially once we see what the feedback is from package managers and users and so on. So that's about it.
Jordan has their hand up, and then I have something I'd like to say.
Yeah, I mean, I can wait until later if you have more to talk about, Jeffrey, but yes, no?
I think that's it.
Okay. So this kind of seems to me like just another flavor of the same flag that we eventually decided not to ship with --type. We went through our whole matrix of like use cases and what we like have to support and what we can choose to support, and things like that. And we ended up going with input type, and partially it was to ensure consensus within our group, and partially it was to deal with upstream objections. The people who can already set node options to define input type, so there's no real additional value in altering that default with a different flag.
That's not quite correct.
Why?
Like you can't set the default input type.
Well,
Like
you can set your node options environment variable to set it as -- input type equals module or whatever, and then that will be the case unless it's overridden. Isn't that the same mechanism you're using to set the default type?
Yeah.
Like anything that you can already do in a command line flag, you can default yourself in node options.
And then it overrides it.
Yes. So that capability already exists merely by input type being a flag. So what I would say is, instead of, since you can, the convention already is, if you want default command line arguments, you set them in your node options environment variable. I think the discussion really should be, do we add a flag that can control that can stand in for a type field in the closest package JSON, essentially. And that would be the -- type flag that we decided previously not to do. And separately, then it also seems like this is proposing is the functionality to change the default for everything, which is also something that feels like something we explicitly decided not to do previously. So if let's say we brought back a -- type flag, like you're talking about, that only applied to within the current package JSON boundary, and kind of pretended that the type flag was set to module there, or the type field was set to module there, then that seems like that would give you what you want, in the sense that you just default node options to input type module and package type module or whatever, and then you've achieved the defaults you want, but and you haven't triggered all the concerns raised in that thread about changing the parsing goal of code you didn't write. So like, that's, to me, seems like a much simpler proposal, but then that seems like the duplicate, like the same proposal we already had and decided not to do. So I guess the question then to me is, why now are we going to reevaluate that decision?
This was a user request. There were a couple of users on the Node repo that asked for this. That's why.
Sure. I mean, there's been a couple of users on the Node repo or elsewhere that have asked for lots of things. I mean, it's good to consider those, but like, there's been a couple of people who've asked for default extension resolution too, and that the fact that people have asked for it, and people have asked for not it as well. So like, I feel like it should be a minimum requirement that people have asked for something, but like, we need to have a higher weight of why do we want to add it than some people have asked for it. So I guess I'm curious about that motivation.
A clarifying question for Jeff. Jeff, when this flag is used, default type, that will be recursive through all of your dependencies, correct?
I mean, the most naive implementation of it, yeah. I mean, and which is obviously the problem. So it's a question of whether we want that or not.
Yeah, and I would object to that. I think that there can be a path forward to changing what the default type of node itself is, if we want to explore that space, but allowing it as an option seems very likely to be ecosystem breaking, because it makes inconsistencies. Like, someone could just set that default type as a flag they always call with Node, and then publish all their packages and tell people to set that flag. I'm not saying that people would use it, but like, the flag seems inherently broken due to the fact that it would require all of the modules in your entire tree to assume the default type that you are saying is the default. And I think people can just add type module to their package JSON. And if we want to eventually in the future, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, consider changing that default, we definitely should be doing so with enough time to ensure that like all other modules have type CommonJS in their tree. Otherwise, like, this flag is just setting people up to break stuff.
I'm not the only one this came from. I just was the one who wrote up the thing. I think Guy had some thoughts based on the perspective of a package manager, and I want to say it was Wes or someone was talking
I can
about
fill in
getting us
there.
on the path towards changing that default to Node, and that's
Right.
what this was kind of part of.
So I guess I was, so it came out of, Jeffrey was working on the ways to, if we could come back around on that type flag. And then as he says, the naive implementation is to do it for everything. And yes, that's breaking, but I was having, I guess what we're doing is we're propagating this type module field out now for everyone to add to their package.json files. And this is something that we've set into motion and that we've created. And as this goes out and people are putting it into their package.json files, we've created like this thing that we haven't worked out how we're going to get rid of the thing we've created, right? So we have to be like responsible creators here and also think about like, what does this thing become? Is this just something that people will just always have to add into their package.json? So I think, what are the ways in which we can deprecate this field or allow some kind of switch at some point later in time? And the problem there, as you say, Miles, is we can't unless every package has type CommonJS in it. And at that point, we have a kind of a chicken and the egg problem, because no packages are going to add type CommonJS because they already exist. And I was trying to talk to package managers to see if they could add this automatically. I was talking with Mal from Yarn, and he was following the ideas, but again, he's not going to do anything in Yarn without clear guidance. So the idea was we could kind of bootstrap this process and say, look, here's something that breaks, here's a flag, but that's setting a bar. And in 3 years' time, maybe package managers are like, yeah, that seems like a good way to move in future. But it's trying to start a conversation, really. And what do we think about that? Is this something, do we care? Do we care that we're having people just entering type module and there's no way to get them to stop doing that? Or do we not like this approach, or do we want it? So it's that issue, but then there was also the issue of if there's other ways that this type flag can be used. So maybe there are 2 separate issues here, that the sort of CLI use cases and then the deprecation of type module and that discussion.
Jordan has their hand up, and then I'd like to say something after.
So I question the premise that we ever want to deprecate that field. I think that the reason we are having trouble right now is because there was a default, because an assumption was made at the inception of Node that this is the only parse goal that Node will ever need. That assumption has proven to be wrong. I think that assumption in every ecosystem will always prove to be wrong. And I think that if in 5 or 10 years, some new super module gets added to JavaScript, we don't want to have to revisit the same exact thing. I think an explicit, forcing always typing the explicit field is the most future-proof thing. And I don't see any problem with people typing type module for the next millennia.
I'd like to second Jordan's sentiment there. I don't really see having to include type module as being a huge burden. And in fact, I think like having more explicit signals is better than less. I'd like to push back a bit, Guy, on the suggestion that this is something that package managers can do. We've already seen in Google and some of our infrastructure for automating installs that having things that change at either publish or install time can cause issues with reproducible builds or with like caching if it's inconsistent in any way. And just in general, I am not a huge fan of there being, major augments at bundle time that are kind of just happening behind the scenes without you knowing about it. This seems like the kind of thing that should be explicit.
That sounds fair. I think it's unfortunate that we were then kind of introducing the doc type and saying deal with it, but I don't see that as a big problem, certainly. And No, that's fine.
All right, so I can update the status doc to just mark this one as like tabled for now or whatever we want to call it. Yeah, we can just leave it at that for now. This is definitely something that could always be added later after we unflag, so there's no urgency on this.
Okay.
Yeah, the original urgency was really just that if we did want a deprecation path, it is a deprecation path that takes many years. And so that was the urgency to try and allow that to be created now. But if it's not something that we're concerned about, then yeah, there's no rush to fix something that isn't broken, as it were.
I mean, I think we could, regardless of this direction, we could try and gently push the ecosystem to add explicit type CommonJS to places. Obviously, we probably won't be able to get everywhere, but like we could probably get NPM and Yarn to add in like a warning when you publish a module that doesn't have a type field, for example.
Right, that's exactly the sort of thinking and creating guidance around that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good idea because it's more explicitness, even if we never intend to alter the default.
Could we perhaps add a documentation note or something like that in the modules docs that, you know, in terms of what our guidance is on this topic? Is that something worth considering?
Seems good to me.
Miles, any thoughts on that?
Can you repeat one more time what the action item you were suggesting was?
Just saying that maybe a note saying that if packages want to set type CommonJS, that's not discouraged because it could be useful in allowing all packages to be explicitly defined as their type, which I don't know if we want to be as explicit as saying that would allow us to switch the default in future. We could say it might allow us to switch the default in future, or we could just say, or we could just leave it at that and say being explicit is worthwhile.
We can even be more explicit ourselves and just say our recommendation is to include this. And I also think that it would be reasonable to maybe make pull requests to Yarn and NPM for their initialization scripts to introduce this type field as one of the things that are initialized.
And I think especially if those seem to be getting traction within those two projects, I think it would also be useful we could write some sort of pull request creation bot that can go and add it to all the existing packages, like sort by, download counts or something, and just try and push it out into the ecosystem.
I had my hand up. I don't know if anyone's.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I'm just thinking more broadly. I don't have the answer for this. I'm just thinking about what you were saying is, should we just recommend that people always include a type field, period? Like, is there an advantage to publishing I mean, like you're saying, if explicitness is always preferred, then shouldn't we just encourage all packages to have type CommonJS or type module, as the case may be? Or is there some reason to?
We should encourage them to do it. I mean, like, if we wanted to go, like, we could even go to the extent of like docs deprecation, runtime deprecation, then just straight up deprecation. But that might be a little bit too disruptive. But we could move towards the like putting warnings in the console if that field is missing, if we are like actually planning to switch the default.
Because the broader implication of that, though, is that like currently the docs are like, you can publish a module as or publish a package as a ESM module by putting type module or by setting your main to an MJS file. It could be a more broader rewrite to the docs of like, I mean, not that we shouldn't encourage people to set their main to be an MJS file, but we would be encouraging them to do that and setting type module. You know what I mean?
Well, or setting type CommonJS and having their main be an MJS file so that they can do a dual package, for example, with a deep import.
Yeah, I think we could bring this offline and maybe someone can make a PR updating the docs. And I think in Node Core proper, we could, if we wanted to create a timeline for doing the switch, we could make a combination of a doc deprecation followed by like a runtime deprecation. And there's also a way to do like non-invasive runtime deprecation. So like warnings that will only print if you include a special flag.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I'm happy to spearhead the doc update, but I'm just thinking like it's broader than adding just one paragraph. It's also like this discussion of how you define a module and how you enable ESM mode, you know, MJS versus type. So that should maybe be a discussion that we have like in an issue or something, as I'm sure people will have opinions. So. That's all I got. Miles, you want to do the next one?
Yeah,
sure. I can take notes when it's not one of my things. I just can't focus on notes and talking at the same time.
So let's take a peek. What do we got next? Has Jan joined us yet? Not yet. So let's look at flags, functionality objects, options, and then hopefully Jan.
Is it other one of my things?
Okay, Jordan, go for it.
Wait, what?
Actually, before we do that, Jordan, can we drop default type from the agenda now?
Yeah,
well, I think we just finished it.
No, but I just mean like, can we remove the agenda label so it's not on future agendas?
So I'm just on my phone. I spaced for a second. What did you want me to go for it with?
I've already removed it. I'm just Jeffrey. I'm asking if you would like to keep that.
Oh no, it doesn't need to be on the agenda anymore. I mean, I will maybe somewhere we should note that we're going to update the docs as a result of this, but that doesn't. That's a separate thing.
Okay. So flags functionality options.
Yeah, I didn't ask this to be on the agenda, so I don't know who. I think this was the same thing we were just talking about of like if we want to revisit package type or whatnot, but I
think I was the one who added it. I was going through our issue tracker and just trying to clean things up. It seemed like there had been some discussion on here, but the discussion had kind of dried up since April. I guess there isn't really anything to discuss with the flags functionality options.
I mean, I can just ask, like, do we want to change anything with regards to flags? Like, are we okay with input type as our only flag, or does anyone still, I mean, part of me still wants to think about input type equals auto, but I don't know if it seems like that's never going to get through. So I don't know if that's worth discussing, but.
I think I'm less concerned about auto and more concerned about the flag being generally useful and having a way to do things without a flag. Like, and that really comes back to the original argument that we had about type that's independent of the last conversation that we were just having. And that just seems like a general thoughtfulness about the flags that we're using. And I think it was specifically, like we got caught up on how should if the module that you're running is interpreted as a module, but then like, how are your dependencies determined? Starts becoming like really edge casey. So I don't have a good answer. Truthfully, I was just kind of okay with what we had right now, and I don't think it's a high priority for unflagging. It's like a thing that would be good to have a better user experience on, but we may find just having people use it a bunch may raise concerns or raise better questions about what we do.
There was only one issue on it in the issue queues so far. Was there, Jeffrey?
What do you mean in the?
On this flag stuff, well, there was only one possible issue that came up, if I recall. My memory's hazy on it, but like only one user who's encountered any kind of confusion around this kind of stuff.
Well, there was a user that found a bug of like.
That was another one. Yeah, which we've resolved. But
is that the one you're thinking of, though?
No,
I can't think of anything else.
What have there not been? Yeah, so if it hasn't come up as a concern and no one's really complaining about it, then, and none of us are worried about it, then I guess it's okay then.
It's good enough for right now, and it can improve naturally as people in the ecosystem open PRs and want to improve it. Okay. So, Jeff, do you think we can close that issue, number 300?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't realize it was still open, so I'm fine with it being closed.
Okay. Cool. So I've closed it. We have 22 open issues and 1 pull request. Still waiting to see. Jan's going to be about 5 minutes. So in the time that it takes him to get here, perhaps we can quickly review the other open issues and see if there's other ones that we can close. Are people open to that?
Could I suggest that we start discussing exports, because it is potentially a quite a long discussion, and maybe we can start by working through some of the issues by the time Jan arrives.
Okay.
Maybe you can introduce it, the stuff that Jan already knows.
Okay, Guy, would you like to take it from here?
Jeffrey, would you like to do the honors?
Oh boy, stick it on me. Okay. All right, the very high level, it's not a fleshed out proposal. We're still like working out the details, but the very high level is what we're thinking of is basically 2 fields, and stop me and correct me, Guy, if I'm misspeaking anything. At the moment, we're thinking of 2 fields, which we're calling imports and exports. So I'll start with exports because that's the one that's more familiar to what's been discussed so far. Exports would be similar to the proposal from like 6 months ago or however long, where it's just an object where on the left is basically a specifier and on the right is a file. So like that, to use that Moment example, say you're the publisher of Moment, you have exports and then you have a key that's like /time zones, and the value would be, period / data / time zone / index.mjs or something like that. So this allows a consumer to do, import time zones from Moment / time zones, and the Moment / time zone specifier gets mapped to that long file path, the URL. So that's like more the public API part of this, of defining how this is to be used by consumers. Imports is a separate thing that is much more akin to the import maps proposal for browsers, where this defines mappings of specifiers within the package. So within Moment, you can define, if you do, I guess this is where it's much more up in the air, like import / time zones, then you map that to ... / time zones / something or other. We're still working all this out, but the idea is that you get a lot of the benefits of the import maps proposal of being able to kind of define, almost like defining symlinks in a way. And we're also talking about letting this define dependencies or different dependencies based on different conditions, and things like that. Is that a fair summary? What am I forgetting, Guy?
Yeah, so imports then covers both, for example, relative specifiers in the package, possibly, and possibly also bare specifier resolutions within the package. Being able to be remapped similarly to exports, but it's the difference between mappings within the package and mappings coming into the package as you sort of enter the package as a subpath. So that's, yeah, exactly what we've been discussing. And yeah, I don't have much more to add right now.
I have my hand up. This kind of feels like 2 features, right? One is a currently impossible thing, which is remapping, like providing, like essentially remapping and creating virtual deep imports for a package. And then the other feature is remapping bare specifiers for that package. But the thing is that NPM already, as of 6.9, provides that second feature. You can say that an import of Moment actually installs not version 123 of Moment, but the version npm :lodash at 123, and then you've remapped it. So it kind of seems like you don't even need that functionality to propose it all.
Loaders definitely they're certainly already today in CommonJS, and I'm assuming that when loaders are built for ESM, they will also support remapping specifiers. I think the thing is that only helps the current project. Like individual packages like Moment can't do that kind of stuff within their own scope,
Right. So the do that stuff within your own scope, that's the first half of the feature, which I think is currently impossible and is highly valuable both for CJS and for ESM. The second piece of the feature is something you can already do for yourself with NPM, and with Yarn. So I don't know why Node itself needs to add it directly. And by adding it, you introduce a complication about how do you differentiate relative versus bare specifiers? Do you require slash, and so on?
Rob has their hand up.
Yeah, I basically want to just fully agree with what Jordan has just said. I think this is two features, and the first part is the exports. The second part we could call imports or aliases, and it's the first part that I think is the higher priority thing to solve, and they just seem like completely separable features. So I would hope we can just solve that first problem first.
I don't know if someone had their hand up. I can try to reply to that.
Jan has.
Jan, you wanna?
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Need to learn again how Zoom works. Right. So trying to sum up the things. So for me, exports is just an extension of the main field. So yes, Yarn and NPM have built-in features that you can use to remap an ESM specifier inside of a package scope, like a bare specifier into a package scope. If it doesn't have any specific path extensions, you can remap it from underscore to Lodash. But that is actually not even touching the exports proposal. That's really just, there's a main field and the rest is kind of out of scope for Node itself, because as long as the dependency is mapped as the name underscore maps to Lodash, it doesn't actually make a big difference. For me, actually, the bigger feature is imports, because exports is at best sugar, right? The only thing that actually changes what you can do beyond what main already does is that you can have specific overrides for subpaths of a bare specifier that map to something else that is not the exact path from the bare specifier. And that is just sugar, right? Because you could just have a slightly longer path and it would do the same thing.
Can I just add, there's one other thing with that, Jan, we forgot to mention, is that it would also lock down anything that's not defined. Like you could kind of give it a wild card to just open up your whole package, but the idea would be if you didn't, by default, only the paths that you specify in exports would be the only exposed paths, so that it's not like your whole package, any file in your package can get imported the way it can now.
Right, but that is something that falls out from the semantics, just because that's how bare specifier resolution would work, but it wouldn't actually be reliable. It was not a security feature. It would be a convenience feature to express an API. It's kind of the underscore property of private state. Because you can still, if you can construct the URL, you can still get to the file. It's just that if you use a bare specifier, it wouldn't automatically be resolved that way for you, which is nice for documentation purposes and for expressing intent, but it's not a security feature.
Just a clarifying question here. So there's a lot of overlap with your proposal and what the browser field already does. And with that, both the keys of the object and the specifier you're trying to get to are normalized, and that's what's compared, which means that you actually don't have a way to get to the original file. It's completely shadowed. And that's not something that's built into your proposal?
Well, with the browser field, the original file just vanishes, which is like, so nothing even inside of the package can get to the original file anymore, which is not really encapsulation as much as replacement, right? So if you overwrite the original file completely on the disk, it would have the same effect, which is nice for browser, like for platform level bundling, but it's not actually like a security feature because nothing can access this. But it is, in quotation marks, perfect security by hiding it from everybody, but also not very useful if you still need to use the code.
But it makes it easier to like statically analyze and see that like all instances, if you know that all instances of imported modules within your tree adhere to imports and then also do not search directly into the node modules folder. Yes, it may not be like clearly a security feature, but it is another static validation that we don't currently have.
Yeah, it's definitely useful, right? It's a useful signal, but it's not really transformative because you can also have a linter that does check that you don't do any path imports into a package. Like there are ways of expressing this. It's not really runtime. Anyhow, so I think the more transformative thing is actually the imports, because that is where, especially like Jordan brought up the browser field, that's where we actually get to new interesting features, because having imports allows us to express things like, hey, this internal path should now be used instead of the original one because I'm running in a certain environment. And that is something that is actually changing what you can do using static imports. That's something that you would otherwise need either an external tool with additional package.json fields that are completely decoupled from the normal module resolution, like the browser field, or you would need runtime code that does conditional await imports, which is, not great for static analyzable and bundling code.
Now, do we have bundlers that are saying that they would use this? Like, would Babel use it? Would Webpack use it? Because realistically, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, like these don't sound like things that we need to support in the runtime necessarily for them to be conventions that people are following. So I've been talking with like Jason Miller, for example. We were talking about entries being the name. We can bike shed the name forever, but that like you can have n number of entries as long as like they're consistent in naming from a convention standpoint. Like Node doesn't need to know anything about that in order for bundlers to get that behavior.
Yeah, that works well for things that they have in mind, which is compiling for different syntax formats, for example, where you basically have a full build in a separate directory with everything in it that is for different environments. It does not work well when you just want to author some JavaScript. Like, for example, I have an HTTP client library that works for web and for Node, where just a single file in the implementation needs to be switched out. If I want to model that using entry points, like the very top level file, it becomes hard and hacky, or I need to actually do bundling, which is something that I don't want to do as a package author necessarily.
How are the browser's runtime going to support this, though?
Well, the idea would be that you can generate an import map from this data, and the tool that generates the import map would be the one that needs to filter out entries that are not supported. So we would use the same array notation that is also used for standard modules, just having some kind of magical marker that says, hey, this entry in this array is meant only for Node. And if your browser tool would just generate the import map, omitting the things that are targeted for Node, and you end up with an import map that in theory should work one-to-one in a browser.
Okay. I am still not entirely convinced that these are not two separate features that should be being explored separately.
I have my hand up. I want to speak to what you were saying,
Yeah.
Miles. The bundlers aren't necessarily applying to the use case at all. Tons of Node packages are forced to put their code in a source directory and then have their output in a build directory or a lib directory or something, which means deep imports are forced to have that extra tax. This sort of feature would allow me to create virtual root level imports that point into my build folder. And so I could abstract the fact that I'm using Babel or TypeScript or something away. So I think that would need to be supported in the Node runtime.
Rob, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think it sounds like there may be some disagreement about which part of the proposal is more valuable, but it seems like everyone's agreeing that these are two separate proposals. Is that fair?
I think it could certainly be like submitted as two separate pull requests, and probably will be. I think what they have in common is they both describe using package.json to remap import specifiers. So in that sense, they need to be designed together and like mesh well, because you don't want to have, if we're creating two new fields that both deal with remapping specifiers, like they should have similar syntax and design, etc. So yeah, like
I guess the biggest difference though is exports is about defining it for the people who are consuming your package, whereas imports is kind of defining, like meta-programming your internal runtime based on environment. So like to me, exports is the one that seems like the obvious thing that absolutely needs to happen as part of like completing the behavior we need, like in my personal opinion, to unflag, whereas imports seems more on the like nice to have or extra meta programming. Like to me, it doesn't seem like imports would block unflagging, whereas exports might. To be
And you can currently use a Babel transform to, for example, on your own package to sugar your imports however you like. You can't do that for exports unless you generate a bunch of like fake files and stuff.
I also think, and I could be wrong, that the exports proposal is pretty one-to-one to patterns that people are already doing today and recreating behavior that already exists in the ecosystem, whereas imports is starting to think about new patterns. I think that we need to bring in more stakeholders before making those kinds of commitments for new things. Jan?
So I think if you're talking isolated Node, then that's true. If you're talking about people like, well, even in Node, there are things like React, I think, that are doing things where based on if it's development or not, they load a development version or production version of the same package. So these kinds of environments, which already exist in the Node ecosystem, and once we add isomorphic universal packages to the mix, they definitely exist. Like this pattern of overriding a path for different environments is something that at least like I have used it using the browser field and using the React Native field and others. So I don't think it's introducing something that is not present in the ecosystem. If anything, it's introducing something that is not present in the ecosystem of JavaScript on the server in Node specifically.
Your proposal doesn't create a way to pivot on the Node end, though, for example. Like you would still need the same exact solution now where you have a dynamic check of process.m. whatever. And you would still presumably need a browser field if you wanted to have a different pair of node end routes for the browser.
Well, hopefully you wouldn't. The proposal is not updated yet with that aspect, which is something that has been discussed in the past, and that is that the proposal would actually have a declarative way of saying things like only load this in a certain environment. But so I think the two issues are, there's a very strong demand in the ecosystem for having a way to have multiple versions of a file or multiple versions of a package, and B, specifying it in a way that is supporting those use cases consistently is very hard. So for me, imports and exports, separating the two proposals wouldn't, like, yes, we can do it, but it's like 3 lines that would change. Like, that's not the big thing. The big thing is, if we want to support environment switching declaratively, what would be the supported way of doing it? And that is the bigger part of the proposal. Like, if I would split the proposal, I would split it into imports and exports, basically building a resolution table, and then making the resolution table environment specific, because that is the 2 big pieces, in my opinion.
And again, pointing to the browser field, it's worth noting that the browser field does not lock out anything. Anything that you import, anything that's imported that doesn't have a key in the browser field, it just works. So again, I think the really new feature here is the ability to say that if it's not listed, you can't get to it. So that's a feature, that's one of the features I'm particularly interested in.
So like, we have the example of React, which has a development and a production build, and you really don't want to run the production build on your the development build on your production server, and you really want to run the development version on your dev machine. Right now, what they are doing is they have an if condition and requires. Like, what would they do? Like, this is a completely node specific example.
So
I mean, some people do want to run the development one on their production server. So like, they would actually alter the environment variable using their bundler just for that package. And they do.
So just to interrupt really quickly, we've only got 5 minutes left on the meeting. And I think it might be good for us to pivot on next steps. Is everyone okay with that? I would like to suggest, and the people who've been working on this proposal may disagree with me, I personally feel like we're ready for the exports field to get a PR opened against core and to iron out the last little bit of behavior, to look at getting it against both ESM and CommonJS and figure out, hey, can we do this to CommonJS in a non-breaking way? What's going to be the cost of this? If I recall, I think Guy already has a bunch of the implementation done. It's not that much code. Let's just open a PR against core and start getting the work towards getting this over the finish line done. Separately, we have the ComCom has groups for doing user outreach. I also know there's a tooling working group. We've had good relationships with Babel and Webpack. I would really, and then Jason and Chris from over at Google have been doing some interesting stuff in this space as well. I think we should continue exploring the imports portion of the proposal and bring in more stakeholders and ensure that what we would implement there would be things that multiple stakeholders would use. Jeffrey?
Yeah, so I wrote the part of the exports proposal in the thing that Jan posted, the Google Doc, so I can be a point person on that or help with whoever's implementing that, guides or anyone else. The other thing I was going to say is if there's one thing that people have been commenting about, or at least that I've noticed that people have been commenting out on the Node repo about experimental modules lately, it's been all the missing functionality we have yet to implement regarding loaders and like stubs for tests and all that kind of stuff. How is this going to work with Jest? How is this going to work with sign-on, etc.? And yeah, we need to be making progress on that. So I was just thinking, if Miles, if you're reaching out to other stakeholders, that could be something else that, like, I think we could use some help in that area.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I'm personally actually trying to see if I can find funding to help support some open source development on loaders. I think that loaders is definitely one of the last things we need to figure out. These other bits are really great and interesting to dig into, but loaders are definitely one of the biggest blockers right now.
I feel like if we don't have good answers to the like how do tests work in ESM, then it's like ESM is incomplete. Whereas like, yeah, exports would be nice to have, but truly it's like, you know, it's a good feature to add, but not like, oh my God, there was something in CommonJS that I can't do in ESM, you know. Is there anything else I'm missing that's like a must-have that we really got to get finished?
I think that's it for right now. Anyone else?
I was just asking in the chat, do we want this to be a strong encapsulation or not? Because we could actually ban even absolute paths within the package from outside the package. There might be ways to do that.
I was thinking we could do that because we're already going to have to check package.json for a type field for like every resolution. So it's like the same code. It could also check the exports field and see like, is this an allowed path for this package scope?
We have the code execution mechanisms being dynamic import and static import. And if both of those
thought about what Wes just commented.
So it's worth thinking about that. There's no such thing as a fake require wrapper. And you're assuming FS access.
John and Rob have their hands up, but we're at time. Are these important things to bring up before we break?
I would just quickly want to throw something towards what Guy just asked, basically.
Yep.
Okay, so the quick note is, I think we definitely do want strict access control. I don't think that the resolution logic is where it should live. It should live outside of resolution logic so that your resolver doesn't need to also make double duty as a access control mechanism.
That is how import maps chose to do it, though, for the record.
But yeah, I think what he's saying is like, it would be something lower level so that it would catch FS, it would catch, you know, all the various places where Node could open a file. That's a broader conversation we should probably have, maybe with someone from the security group. Anyway, that's all I got. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, calling it a day. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Talk to you all soon.
You're on.